Okay, everyone. So I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Firstly, allow me to give you a few words of welcome. Welcome, welcome, welcome. I'm very pleased to see so many familiar faces here this morning. And of course, there's some faces that are new to me. So let me just introduce myself. My name is Winston Thompson. I'm an associate professor of educational studies and philosophy by courtesy. I'm also a member of the steering committee for the Center for Ethics and Human Values here at Ohio State. And it's through that work that I'm coordinating this year's COMPAS, or Conversations on Morality, Politics, and Society program. COMPAS is one of the central event series of the center. It brings together a range of thoughtful voices to focus our collective attention on important matters of public concern. This year's theme, Education in Our Democracy, has provided ample opportunities to consider the past, the present, and the future of our society through the prism of education as an often contested pathway to participation in that abiding project. Today's mini-conference, Should Education Be Less Divisive?, picks up on a thread of issues that have risen to public attention in recent years. Claims of divisive subject matter and identities in K-12 education populate the headlines across this country. Higher educational campuses have, in many ways, become the center of increasing anxieties regarding division and polarization. At core, all these concerns might seem predicated on a sense that the stakes are extraordinarily high in educational contexts. To assist us in navigating these matters, we're joined by a stellar collection of experts. So I'm glad to have all of you join us today for this full session, this day full of sessions. And the first of these sessions actually begins right now. We'll be turning our attention to subject matter that students receive within their schools. And as I mentioned, controversies have seemed to intensify regarding the curricular content of schools. So this morning, with a focus on racialized histories and political content, our morning panel aims to discuss the ethical issues of these debates. And in this, we're led by CEHV's Associate Director, Dr. Aaron Yarmel. Dr. Yarmel is a philosopher who works across a range of subjects in political philosophy, philosophy of education, applied ethics, and normative ethics. Given his expertise regarding the intersection of these areas of focus, I think you'll all agree with me that he's the perfect guide to these matters this morning. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Aaron Yarmel.
Thanks very much for that wonderful introduction, Winston. So it's a real honor to be here. I'm really looking forward to our first panel of the morning. And what I'd like to do is just introduce our two speakers. So first we have Dr. Hasan Jeffries. Dr. Hasan Jeffries teaches, writes, and researches about the African American experience from a historical perspective. He has chronicled the civil rights movement in the 10-episode Audible original series, Great Figures of the Civil Rights Movement, and has told the remarkable story of the original Black Panther Party in Bloody Loundis, Civil Rights and Black Power in Alabama's Black Belt, which has been praised as the book historians of the Black freedom movement have been waiting for. Hasan has collaborated on several public history projects, including serving as the lead scholar and primary scriptwriter for the $27 million renovation and redesign of the National Civil Rights Museum at the Lorraine Hotel in Memphis, Tennessee, the site of the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. Hasan regularly shares his expertise on African American history and contemporary Black politics through public lectures, op-eds, and interviews with print, radio, and television news outlets, including the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, NPR, CNN, and MSNBC. He's contributed to several documentary film projects as a featured on-camera scholar, including the Emmy-nominated PBS documentary Black America Since MLK and Still I Rise. Hasan's commitment to teaching hard history led him to edit Understanding and Teaching the Civil Rights Movement, a collection of essays by leading civil rights scholars and teachers that explores how to teach civil rights history accurately and effectively, and to host the podcast Teaching Hard History, a project of the Southern Poverty Law Center's Learning for Justice Division. Hasan also helps school districts develop anti-racism programming and culturally responsive curricular content centered on social studies by conducting professional development workshops for teachers and administrators. An associate professor in the Department of History at The Ohio State University, Hasan takes great pride in opening students' minds to new ways of understanding the past and the present. For his pedagogical creativity and effectiveness, he has received numerous awards, including Ohio State's highest commendation for teaching, the Ohio State Alumni Award for Distinguished Teaching. Hasan graduated from Morehouse College with a BA in history and earned his PhD in American history with a specialization in African American history from Duke University. So welcome, Hasan. It's an honor to have you here. I'd also like to welcome Dr. Paula McAvoy up here. So Dr. McAvoy is Associate Professor and PhD Coordinator for the Social Studies Program Area of Study in Teacher Education and Learning Sciences at North Carolina State University. She earned her PhD in Philosophy of Education in 2010 at UW-Madison's Department of Educational Policy Studies. Since then, she's worked as an assistant professor at Illinois State, an associate program officer at the Spencer Foundation, and as the director of the Center for Ethics and Education at UW-Madison. Prior to this, she taught high school social studies for 10 years at the Foothill Middle College program in Los Altos, California. Dr. McAvoy's research focuses on philosophical and empirical questions concerning the relationship between schools and democratic society. She's the co-author of The Political Classroom, Evidence and Ethics in Democratic Education, which won the Grauermeyer Award for Education and the AERA Book Award. Welcome, Dr. McAvoy. So without any further ado, we're going to begin. Why don't we have Dr. McAvoy come on up here and kick us off. Yep, yeah, you can bring that mic.
Okay. Hello. Hi, everyone. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. And I want to give a thanks to Winston and the team at the center for the invitation. I was saying at dinner last night, I think this might be my first face-to-face academic appearance in quite a while. So hopefully I remember how to do this. The question that we've been asked to discuss on this first panel is our curriculum divisive? And my first answer when I heard the question was no. If what we mean by devices is intending to divide. In fact, if you look at state standards as one guide for curriculum planning, these are generally consensus documents that seek common ground among a diverse set of stakeholders. This is often what also makes them a little bit intellectually watered down and can lead to some fairly uninspiring classroom practices. But the intention is to guide teachers toward the content that most people find unobjectionable. But still, teachers make a variety of choices in the classroom, and even if you look at more social justice-oriented curricula, which often gets labeled biased, this curriculum is usually aiming to be inclusive, fair, and attentive to voices often silenced through things like state standards. And so not intending to cause division and instead trying to create a more just society, this is where the purpose of this sort of move in the curriculum. But of course, there's public disagreement about what a more just society looks like, and this can be the cause of political conflict. But this sort of disagreement has been happening in schools for a long time, and it's often seen as a normal part of democracy. And so if teachers lean a little too far toward what we might call the dominant view of history, then liberals might get a little unhappy. And if you lean a little too far toward the social justice-oriented curriculum, conservatives get a little unhappy. But teachers, in my experience and in my research, generally don't stray very far from the community norms. And so you generally don't see a large big upheaval at the local level that we're seeing currently at the national level. Though certainly the national has now percolated or dripped down into the local. But the motivation for this question, we certainly see a lot of divisiveness around schools today. And so I think the framing of the question is the curriculum devices is actually misdirecting us to look at schools as the instigator of the divisions that we see today, in which states and local districts are passing what is being referred to as anti-CRT laws. And there's also, of course, the Don't Say Gay laws. I'm going to focus primarily on the CRT laws, though those also include gender and gender identity within them. So these laws and the controversies surrounding them are the result of the political right using schools as a wedge issue to motivate the base. In this way, the right is exacerbating what might be seen as common disagreements at the school level about what should be taught and exacerbating it into a national crisis. It's done with intention and it's done for political gain. So I think it's worth, as the opening talk today, to look at at the history of how it happened. And it might be familiar to some, but maybe the details aren't familiar to everybody. So very briefly, the story of the anti-CRT laws begins with Chris Rufo, a conservative blogger and freelance journalist and filmmaker who in the summer of 2020 received a set of materials from an anti-bias training that was happening for the city of Seattle. One participant in the training was upset by the content and passes it along to Chris Rufo. This was in 2020, during a summer of protests following the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and others. It was also during the COVID shutdown, so these trainings were happening in cities and corporations, and they were happening online. And so it was very easy to grab the materials, the PowerPoints, et cetera, and send them along. So Chris Rufo starts getting these. He follows the footnotes, then he follows the footnotes, and he comes across the term critical race theory. Was that? And recognizes that term, critical race theory, whatever you want it to mean, has political traction. Critical sounds anti-American. Theory sounds mushy and kind of made up. And the public is already in the middle of a national conversation about race and racism. And so he grabs the term and in fact calls it in a later tweet, he was able to create a boogeyman with the term. And he starts writing and tweeting that this is a dangerous ideology that we have to be attentive to. He eventually gets invited to Fox News's Tucker Carlson, where he appeals to Trump directly to issue an executive order to banning the use of critical race theory and DEI materials from federal agencies. The very next morning, he is called to the White House. The executive order follows shortly. And then the attention turns to schools as the next public institution where one can use this new political weapon. So in the summer of 2021, where and Chris Rufo begins consulting on this legislation. So in the summer of 2021, Media Matters reports that Fox News mentioned CRT over 1,900 times in a 3-month period. And forces it into the public discourse. 36 states considered legislation to restrict the teaching of race. It passed, I believe currently it's passed in 13, pending in others and rejected in others. In addition, research from UCLA and UCSD has found that over 500 jurisdictions in the US, so from school boards on up, the electoral chain, have considered adopting policies to restrict the teaching of race. The same research finds that even when the laws don't pass, teachers have received the message, principals have received the message, parents have received the message, do not teach about racism, stay away from things that are controversial and quote unquote divisive, including gender, sexuality, et cetera. And so we've created there's teachers who feel no effect from these laws because they are sort of left-leaning teachers in left-leaning areas of the country. Then there are teachers who are untouched because they're sort of conservative, there's sort of general conservative agreement. And then we have these sort of more politically divided areas in which teachers are feeling a lot of scrutiny on their practices. In one example from the research from UCLA, a teacher reported worrying about teaching the 19th Amendment because she didn't want to bring up too much about gender in the classroom. So this is, teachers have started retreating from content that we would find completely unobjectionable. So even when the divisiveness is manufactured, which it is, the reality is that the culture around schools has changed. Teachers have experienced extreme distrust. For so many teachers reporting that I've never felt anything like this before about my practice. Being told by kindergarten teachers, being told by principals to don't teach critical race theory in the kindergarten classroom. And so the pressure becomes real. And the scrutiny that has followed teachers makes them more likely to want to avoid teaching difficult subjects and controversial issues. And I should say that that's not exactly new. Teachers have always sort of avoided difficult topics and controversial issues, but even the ones that were willing to do it are now feeling the pressure to retreat. So much of my own research focuses on engaging students in discussions of controversial political issues. And this includes empirical research on the effects of these discussions on students and the ethics of introducing politics in the classroom. So prior to this legislative story, it was really hard to get teachers to do this. Discussion is, in fact, a rarely used tool in the social studies classroom. There can be student talk, but it rarely rises to the level of actual discussion. So one thing I do is I train teachers within my faculty position, but I also provide a lot of professional development for teachers around the country on how to use strategies that engage students in actual discussions, and to think about some of the ethical challenges that they are likely to face when they bring politics into the classroom. So one message that I've been giving lately in face of this controversy is that if you're worried about these laws, then one response is to put more of the intellectual work of the classroom onto students. So in other words, real discussion in which teachers are sharing authority with the students over where the discussion goes and it's not just sort of this fake discussion of I say a comment and the teacher mediates that comment, but you're actually doing a student-centered discussion about controversial issues. That has the effect of a lot of these laws are looking at what does the teacher say, so let's put more of the responsibility to speak on students. But one thing that teachers struggle with how to do when they have discussion is what should they introduce as open for discussion. So this becomes a very difficult thing for teachers to sort out. And so what I wanted to show today, are you timing me, manager? Or does it matter? Are we okay? So let me just say that when we talk about controversial issues, we get unclear about what we're talking about. So I just want to quickly a couple of terms. So there's a whole literature on what should count as a controversial issue. Let's just agree that some things are controversial. So let's just use this very simple definition. A question that has multiple competing views, a question that invites disagreement. And so when I talk to teachers, I say one thing you want is disagreement. We want a little disagreement. It's very difficult to have a discussion in which there's no disagreement. So what the purpose is to sort of unearth disagreement. And then there's this thing that I differentiate this from controversial topic, which is content that could invite scrutiny from inside or outside of the class. This is often content that challenges dominant narratives in society. These are often related to race, gender, sexual identity, sex, religion, ethnicity. So sex education is a controversial topic. Should that be taught in schools at all? How should we talk about the legacy of racism? This is what's currently being questioned as, is that appropriate content for the school classroom? Now you can have controversial issues that touch on controversial content, and so that's where it gets sort of mushy in the public discourse. Are we talking about a topic, or are we talking about an issue that's open for discussion? And so much of what I try to encourage teachers to do in the research that I do is on a particular type of talk, which is deliberation. So we can engage students in all sorts of talk and discussion and debate in classrooms. And I think it's helpful to think about what sorts of discussions are we actually trying to have, because different discussions have different outcomes, different values, different norms. So deliberation I like for being particularly democratic in its design and purpose. And so let's take this as a definition: a discussion that aims to make a decision or come to an agreement about a public policy issue. So we deliberate in democracies about the policies we're going to put on each other. And in a classroom, we're often simulating deliberations. So we're asking students to think about what should the gun policies be in the United States, but it's not that they actually get to decide gun policy, they're just practicing sort of the art of deliberation. Okay, so then in the past professional developments that I've done, I've kind of taken, let's take a controversial topic, a controversial issue, and think about how we should treat that in the classroom. And so I've developed a little exercise that I'm gonna just share with you here. Around the issue of Confederate monuments and what should happen to them. Okay, so the exercise goes like this. Imagine that you're a social studies teacher and you're finishing a unit on Reconstruction in the United States, and you want to end the unit with an interesting discussion about a topic and issue related to the legacy of slavery, and have students think about this. And so the questions I'm going to ask you then, or you or the teacher or the participants, which would you use as open for discussion in the classroom? And so you can think, why were Confederate monuments created? Were Confederate monuments intended to be an expression of white supremacy? Should Confederate monuments be removed from public places? What, if anything, should a particular case, Richmond, Virginia, do with its Confederate monuments? Or how do Confederate monuments make you feel? So if we were in the workshop, I would have you work with a partner to think through what would you do, how would you treat each of these questions? Which one do you think is the best if you're gonna end a unit on the Reconstruction to open up for students to discuss? And teachers generally can come to, through that discussion, they recognize that, so this first question, why were Confederate monuments created, is a historical question. We can answer it by looking back at the evidence. And when you do look, and it's pretty clear, it's not like this is a big mystery where the Confederate monuments came from. And in fact, this is one of the answers, probably the primary answer. Were Confederate monuments intended to be an expression of white supremacy? You can also look to the record, historical record, and you think, yeah, it really does look like those are intended to be an expression of white supremacy. This one is an open question. What should you do about them now that we have them? And so you could debate that question. You could divide the class into two sides and say yes or no. You could also deliberate that. You could have an open discussion of what to do about that. This question is what I try to nudge the participants toward, and then I have a whole set of materials on this particular case. What, if anything, should Richmond, Virginia do? That's a nice deliberative question. It's open enough to say that you can put in a lot. You could say they should be modified, there should be counter monuments, there should be, so you can, it opens a lot of possibility, and it's more than a yes, no. So that creates, and so we have deliberative exercises in the social studies business that would get you at that. And then this one, to me, the last one is a question of dialogue. And you might open with, when you see these things, what do you think and feel? As a way to just sort of start a conversation. Teachers generally hate that question. They reject, I keep suggesting, like, I think this is a nice question. And they're like, no, terrible, I would never ask about feelings. Like, but there are feelings related to like why are we so afraid? Why do we want to reject the feelings? Anyway, let's set that one aside. But so here's what happens when I see teachers struggle with this, is that there are many teachers that they agree that we should do something like question 3 or question 4, but they worry. What's going to happen if I open that up to discussion? I'm going to invite all these bad arguments. I'm going to invite, it's going to cause like, my grandmother said this and my grandfather, and this is what it means, like, oh, that's too much. I'm not going to be able to handle that discussion. And then the questions 1 and 2, though, those are not open for discussion. So to to treat two as an open question is to invite a miseducation of students. If they end up coming to the conclusion, I think they're fine, and they're just monuments to soldiers, that's all they are, you've now left them with bad information. But I had a teacher in a workshop this summer say, I agree with you that two has a right answer. I just can't say two in my classroom. I cannot say that the monuments were created for white supremacy. And I said, that's good that you know that. And that's true. You shouldn't just say that. You shouldn't just go into a class and say, believe me that that these are expressions of white supremacy. That 1 and 2, basically what you're saying is you need to teach 1 and 2 in order to get to the open questions 3 and 4, right? So that has to be laid down. And you do that laying down by looking at evidence. So that's, Monday and Tuesday, we're looking at 1 and 2, and Thursday, or Friday, Wednesday, whatever the next day of the week is, we're gonna look at the open question. And so so what teachers often miss is that they wanna put the deliberative question and the empirical questions all in the same lesson and have people struggle through those simultaneously. And that's when discussions get real messy and go the wrong way. So helping teachers sort out which questions I should treat as settled, how I then should get the class toward those settled questions, and then how to set up and design a deliberation so that students are sharing ideas about the real questions about what should we do now. So that's my opening invitation for discussion. And I'll just conclude by saying I think that we need in this moment to help teachers understand that you have an obligation to teach the truth, right? So leaving open so obligation to teach truth, but we also need to leave open for students where we go from that truth. How do we move on from here? And so if schools are going to be institutions that have any chance of supporting democracy, we have to get teachers ready to prepare students for these discussions and be on solid empirical footing about where we've come and where we might need to go from here. So thank you.
Wonderful. Well, good morning, everyone. It is great to be with you. I look forward to the conversation and dialogue and discussion, not just in this panel, but for the day as a whole. I want to underscore. I'm so glad we had a chance to wait. Let me put this on, because I haven't been speaking in public either, so I'll just go on. So let me make sure I keep an eye on the clock here. Underscore a couple of things that were just said, and I very much look forward to how we discuss our deliberations in a little bit. Ohio has not passed yet, and hopefully won't, but has not passed yet, one of these divisive concept bills. It has introduced 3 within the state legislature. The third, most recently, House Bill 616 into the state and local committee. And it names as divisive concepts in the bill, no surprise, critical race theory by name. It identifies what can't be taught or prohibited in K through, not just K through 12, but it also actually applies to higher education. Sometimes I forget I'm a state employee, but here at Ohio State, we are in fact state employees, so this would apply to us as well. It says that names, in particular, the 1619 project, and we'll come back to that shortly. It identifies diversity, equity, and inclusion learning outcomes, DEI learning outcomes, as divisive and inherently racist concepts, and they should not be taught. And prohibits in our bill in the great state of Ohio, prohibits teaching kindergartners about topics related to gender identity, to sexual orientation, and the like. So that's our divisive concepts bill. Go Ohio. To piggyback a little bit on sort of the origin, so what's the context for all of this nonsense? And it absolutely goes back to activists coming out of the political right. But I think there are two things, and one, none of this is new, right? I mean, in terms of wanting to limit what is being taught in our classrooms, particularly around issues of race and racism, right? Like, we don't want to deal, I talk about hard history as a historian, we don't want to deal with those aspects of our past that make us uncomfortable in the present, right? Generally, we just want to stay away from those. But this is more than that, right? This is a manufactured political crises, right? This is manufactured political hysteria. And it ties to two things in the current moment. One is the election of Donald Trump, right? Not just in 2016, but really the attempted re-election in 2020, right? Because we see leading up to that election, when they start playing with this thing called the 1776 Project, and I mean, all of essentially that becomes the blueprint for all of the divisive concept bills that wind up working their way through state legislatures starting in 2020. So it was a desperate pitch and appeal on the part of Donald Trump to rally his base around white supremacy, right? The former president may not know many things, but he knows that racism is the most powerful political organizing tool that America has ever created, and was not afraid to use it, right? And so when this reaches his attention as he's watching Fox News in August of 2019, he's like, oh yeah, let's roll with this, right? I mean, so that is at play. And it's not just him, but it's a way for elected officials after he loses, which is critical. It's a way for political conservatives after he loses to keep those who were most animated by race and racism, or racism in particular, to stay engaged, right? So this is one of the ways, right? So you have voter fraud as one thing, but then it's also how can we keep voters, political conservative voters, those most animated by racism, but also those who aren't necessarily, right, animated as viscerally by appeals to white supremacy. How can we keep them engaged? I mean, we see this play out in Virginia in the governor's race, right? So you have the politics of that. But this also has a lot to do with the summer of 2020, right? And the protests that follow the killing of George Floyd. You know, we can't brush over those, right? And what we saw in the summer of 2020. Those were the largest protests that we have seen in American history. Not even close. Not even close. Estimates in June have 25 million people taken to the streets. July, 25 million people taken to the streets. I mean, by comparison, the March on Washington, the largest march during the Civil Rights Movement in August of 1963 had 250,000 people for an afternoon, right? We're talking about consecutive months, millions of people. And not just black folk. Right? I mean, that's the other thing that's so critically important. This is the most white people we ever seen in the streets ever in American history, right? And they weren't just calling for an end to police violence, right? They weren't just calling for justice for the victims of police violence. That they were, to be sure. They weren't just calling for a recognition of black humanity, as we saw depicted in those beautiful murals, that Black Lives Matter murals in plazas that dotted the landscape. They were also calling for, and this was new, this was different, and this scared the hell out of us on a political right, also calling for an end to systemic racism. I say this, now black folk were like, look, we got to deal with institutions of racism and white supremacy since day one, right? I mean, this is, you know, coming out of black power. I mean, that's nothing new. But when little Kylie goes back to the suburbs and is like, Mom, we got to deal with systemic racism, that shook people to the core, because there's only two things that you can do. Either address it and change existing systems and structures, or do nothing. and the recognition that we have a substantial part of the population that benefits from the status quo as it exists, they want to do nothing. But how can you justify doing nothing? You justify it by saying that systemic racism isn't real, right? And if you're able to get people to say systemic racism isn't real, right, then why is it being taught as something in the classroom that is real, right? And so the response then to justify doing nothing about the demands that people are placing on those in power was in part this idea that we have to change what's being taught in the classrooms. And this isn't just a one-off thing, right? Because it has been, is it true that when you talk about and teach about American history in its proper context, when you teach the truth, that it shakes students? Yeah, right? But that's what we should be doing, right, in the classroom. I like to, after the students, have their K through 12 experience, and they wind up in my classroom at Ohio State, where wonderful students, a lot of white kids. Ohio State is very white. When they enter my classroom and I'm teaching African American history or the civil rights movement, or African American film or U.S. history, and from day one, we're just going to make things plain, right? We're going to talk about white supremacy. We're going to talk about racial violence. We're going to talk about lynching, right? And these things, we're talking about slavery and the founders holding people in bondage and buying and selling folk, right? We're going to talk about it truthfully. We're going to talk about it honestly. We're going to talk about it accurately. And when I present these things to students very early on, they wind up over the course of the semester going through the 5 stages of grief, right? And at first, it's like, that shit ain't happen, right? It's like lynching? No, impossible. Not in America. I mean, these are actual things. The shock, it's literal shock, couldn't have happened. Impossible. First stage, denial, right? Now, I also understand that I'm an African American, I'm a black man. Most of my students, being white at Ohio State, not only is Ohio State white, it's actually getting whiter, but that's a conversation for a separate day. They've never had an African American, a person of color, actually in a position of authority before in their lives. Right? Most of my students have not had, right? And so I also understand that I just can't, day one, be like, yeah, let's talk about Thomas Jefferson, right? Let me tell you about Thomas Jefferson. Like, no. They have to encounter and explore and come and see these folk for who they are on their own terms and usually in their own words, right? So it's primary sources, this is the language. Like, I don't got to make anything up. They said it all. Thomas Jefferson couldn't stop talking, right? It's like, look, let me show you what he said. And so very early on, as they're in that denial phase, right? I'm like, don't take my word for it. In fact, I'm not even going to say anything, right? Just look. Look at the historical evidence, right? That's the question 1 and 2, right? Look at the historical evidence, and then we can come from there. So once they see that, right, like, oh, this isn't just sort of liberal professor talking crazy, right? It's like, my goodness, there's actual evidence for this. Then it's stage 2, which is anger, right? But they're not angry at me. I've never had a student ever get angry at me. I mean, for grades, yeah, but not for what we were teaching in the classroom. The anger. They don't get angry at me. They get angry at all those teachers that they had before, K through 12, who never shared any of this with them. Right? And that anger is real. It's palpable, right? I mean, they're in my office at stage 3, right, which is bargaining, right? Like, well, why didn't she tell me this before? Maybe they didn't know, or maybe it wasn't like this. I'm like, no, they knew, right? And for the most part, they with the conscious decisions not to teach this and the broader issues about the, about what we should be learning. And then I asked them the question, well, why don't you think you didn't learn this? Why wasn't this in the curriculum? Right? We move out of bargaining, and then stage 4, if you remember, is depression. I keep a lot of tissue in my office, right? Because like, oh my God, what does it mean? That Mimar was a segregationist, right? And it gets deeply personal, which is part of the reason why we tend to shy away from dealing with this anyway, right? Because it isn't just theoretical and abstract. When you dig down, like, we have family members who lined up on these sides, who are on the wrong side of history. So what does it mean? And then the 5th is acceptance, right? It's like, okay, I get it. Right? At the end of the semester, they're like, Dr. Jeffries, I understand, right? I accept that this was the history. I accept that it wasn't just something that was forgotten, but that there was an intentional leaving out of this history, right, in the past. So those are the 5 stages, but there's a 6th stage, right, that I like to throw in, that I've seen my students get to. And this is what scares a lot of people, because it happens time and time again. That 6th stage is action. Because after the acceptance, they're like, well, what are we going to do about it? Right? Like that. So it's not that, you have liberal professors running around Ohio State University saying, hey, let's create Marxists, right? It's like, once you lay this stuff out, it becomes quite clear that something needs to be done about it. And this is an activist generation, right? I mean, they're looking around. It's not an accident. We weren't leading 25, 30 million kids out to the streets around gun violence and the murder of innocent black folk. I mean, that was them leading us. And so that action stage is what really frightens a lot of people, and I think is what is driving this anti-honesty in education movement right now. This last thing, if I may, and then I'll wrap up. So what should we be teaching? We should be teaching the truth. Right? We should be teaching history as it happened. Now, we can debate truth, but some stuff just happened, like the Confederate monument stuff, right? Like there's no debate about whether or not this was driven by white supremacy, right? Of course it was, right? So we need to be teaching this truth. The other thing is, well, when do we teach it and how do we teach it, right? Like at what? Because part of the angle or the argument for these not teaching honestly about America's past and present is, well, you got to wait, right? Wait until they're mature enough, right? Wait until but then it's too late, right? I mean, kids understand identifying people, especially on the question of race and racism. When they're 2 and 3 months old, they're able to identify people by race because they're picking up on the cues and clues that they're taking from their caregivers. So there is no time that's too early. I will leave you with this. A couple of years ago, my youngest daughter, who's 7 years old now, so this is right before the pandemic. She was 3 years old, which is like 20 years ago. She was in second year of preschool. Goes to all-girls school, multiracial, multi-ethnic, but mostly white. And her teachers came up to me and asked. They were having a King Day assembly, and all the students were going to go. And she said, we would like before the King Day assembly if you, because they know I teach history, if you could come in and talk to the kids about Martin Luther King Jr. Right? And I said, hell no. Right? Because 4-year-olds scare me, including my own, right? Because they ask questions, they have no fear, right? They'll go anywhere. Well, I was like, no. And they were like, oh, you're joking. I was like, no, I'm not joking. They scare me. I'm not talking to them. And they said, and to ease my worry and concern, the teacher said, well, listen, they don't know that much about Dr. King. That's why we want you to come in. In fact, they know he was killed, but they think he was killed by a dragon. And I was like, what? And she says, because of the association with king, right? And kings and fairy tales, and kings are killed by dragons and fight dragons and all this stuff, right? And I was like, and that's supposed to make me feel more comfortable, right, coming in? So eventually I go and I sit down and I talk to the kids, nervous, and I talk to the kids. I said, well, how do I talk to a 4-year-old about Martin Luther King, right? How can I get them connect to this person who, we often have frozen on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial? And I said, well, talk to him about King as a kid, right? Growing up in Jim Crow, Georgia, and what he couldn't do, and what he observes, and why that made him upset, and was it fair or not? And then I talked to them about 1963 and Birmingham, Alabama, and the Children's Crusade, right? Because this is when you have kids their own age, right, who were walking and marching alongside Dr. King and going to jail, fighting for justice. And we talk a little bit about that. And then, they had questions. Right? And their questions were any of the children who were at the marching with Dr. King, were they killed? Because we know Dr. King was killed. Like, no, they weren't killed. And did they go to jail? I was like, yes. Well, who arrested them? The police. So weren't the police supposed to protect them? Like, no, they were the one turning the hoses on, right? I mean, and their questions were clear, direct, and I mean they were really absorbing this stuff, right? And then one kid was, well, how was Dr. King killed? Another kid shouts out, well, he was shot. And I was like, okay, now we're getting heavy, right? And the other kid was like, well, what was the gun? I was like, now we're getting too specific. I was like, it was a rifle, let's move on, right? So at the end, I'll wrap up. So we get through. I survived the Q&A of the 4-year-olds, right? And I give my daughter a kiss and I make a dash for the door, right? Like I'm out. Later that evening, we are at home and I'm getting ready for the next day and it's late. I mean, it's 11:30. My 4-year-old then, 7-year-old, she never sleeps and she didn't sleep then, she doesn't sleep now. So it's 11:30 and she's filibustering, right? I mean, she's just like, Dad, this, that, and the other. But she knows me, right? So she says, she said, Dad, I enjoyed today. I enjoyed today. And she hadn't asked any questions in class. She hadn't really said anything about it, right? And I was like, oh, okay. And she's laying in our bed, right? I said, oh, okay. And I said, well, what did you learn, right? And she starts sharing back the things that we talked about, him growing up in Jim Crow, Georgia. And then she got to the part of the Children's Crusade and the children in the march. And she said, and there were children who marched with Dr. King, and none of them were killed. And when I heard her say that, I realized that I misspoke, that I was wrong. While technically no children were killed while marching with Dr. King in the spring of 63, there were 4 little girls who died at 60th Street Baptist Church as a direct result of the children's movement, right? The children's participation in this movement. And I said, actually, Alayla, I said I was wrong. There were actually 4 girls who were killed participating in this march. And she paused, she was quiet for a second, and then she said, what were their names? And I said, well, one was Cynthia Wesley, and I said, give me my phone, because she had my phone. I said, give me my phone, and I said, we can look it up. So a quick Google search, pull up the 4 names, I read the names, and they have the pictures that you've all seen, the black and white sort of pictures, and I show her the pictures, and I said, this is what they look like, and she looks at one, and she says, that looks like Asha, who was her older sister, right? And she asked a couple more questions about the girls, about 16th, about the church, and this, that, and the other. And then she just sort of, was quiet, right? And I sort of get up and she lays down. She closes her eyes, about 5 minutes or so go by, and I think she's asleep, right? I'm like, all right, mission accomplished. I can go do laundry. And then I hear her say, doesn't turn around. She just says this, eyes still closed. She says, Daddy, I think he was trying to say that America was damaged. And I said, what did you say? She said, I think he was trying to say that America was damaged. Who? Martin Luther King. Damaged? She said, yeah, damaged. And then she just closed her eyes and went to sleep. And I was left thinking that for a quarter century, I've been studying this stuff. And I had never been able to succinctly put together what it was Dr. King was trying to do. He was absolutely trying to tell us that America was damaged, and then offering us a blueprint for how to change it. That's a 4-year-old. They get it. It's never too early to begin talking about this stuff and teaching it accurately and effectively, and then building on it, the scaffolding. But that's also what people are afraid of. Because if you can see and recognize and acknowledge that America is damaged, and you want to then do something about it, then the status quo will not prevail. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you to both of those. Were incredible presentations. I definitely learned a lot, and I'm sure other people in the room did as well. So what we'll do now is we'll move to a discussion about some of the topics that came up. I'll pose a couple of questions as moderator, and then we'll invite some questions from the audience. I want to start by touching on one thing that I think both of you touched on a little bit in your talks, and it's just this idea that there's wild misconceptions in the public sphere about what's going on inside classrooms. Paula, you mentioned that people are concerned with teaching critical race theory in kindergarten. You talked a little bit about your experience in the college classroom, and in ways that I think some people who are trying to follow the debate but might not have access to the classroom might find surprising. And so it's sort of a two-part question. First, I just want to ask you, what do you see as the most significant misconceptions that people have about the way that this sort of curriculum, politically controversial curriculum, is taught in the classroom? And then what advice do you have for people who are just casual observers of the conversation, who don't have this kind of access that the two of you have had through your consulting work, through your teaching, and through your teaching consulting work as well?
I mean, it's hard to identify the biggest misconception. There's so many misconceptions. I mean, I think the biggest misconception is that in most classrooms that I see, the curriculum is really bland and dull. This is not, there's not, whenever I've seen anything that looks like it might be touching upon something sort of interesting or in the heart of history, it's most likely when those reflect the values of the community. So you can go into Chicago and you'll see some more radical or left-leaning or whatever teaching, but for the most part, teachers are pretty, they're more than pretty, they're too leery of parent pushback. And so when I'm talking with my students, and it's okay if a parent questions what you do. All you have to do is explain why you're doing what you do. And you should also be looking for schools in which a principal will be backing up what you do. So you need to know what you're doing and why, do it well, and be ready to defend it. And so, so I think that so I just think that there's just broad misconception that there's all this change happening or radical behaviors. I wish. So I think that's the.
I think as well, and we should be clear, this is not, these aren't black parents, these aren't Latino parents, right, who are worried that their children are learning about race and racism and having, conversations about this stuff. These are white parents, and, suburban, rural, across the country, moms, right? And part of the misconception, I think, that's connected is that their white children are being taught to hate themselves, right? At least that's the language and the framing that is being shared. And as you said, that ain't happening, right? Even when you have conversations, even when you're teaching in age-appropriate ways, whatever level that is, about the difficulties of the past, right? Whether we're talking about slavery or Jim Crow, whatever it is, especially as it's related to race, because this is tied up with racial identity. Nobody is blaming little white kids for slavery, right? No children in America are being taught that they're responsible for America's past. They're not even being taught that they are somehow responsible for the mess that we've created today, right? So that's just not happening. But what should be happening is that kids should be taught that they are responsible for tomorrow and solving the problems that we haven't solved. And so part of exploring in truthful and honest ways the past and the present is to prepare kids for tomorrow, right? To address these issues. And that's what we should be getting, but you can't get there if you don't deal with the past in honest ways. And if parents truly believe that, oh my goodness, right, you're teaching white kids, teaching our little white kids to hate themselves and to hate America, then the teachers will be afraid, right, to talk honestly about the past. And if you don't do that, I honestly don't know what version of American history you're teaching if you don't teach those issues that are deemed controversial, right? It's just, you gotta talk about you can't talk about America without talking about white supremacy, right? You can't understand it, period. And the one thing that we shouldn't be doing is we shouldn't be miseducating our children. And intentionally leaving stuff out is doing just that.
Thank you. I'm going to turn to a question primarily for you, Dr. Jeffries, then we'll turn to one for Dr. McAvoy. So I'm fascinated by your research. You've done remarkable work on the Black Panther Party, on the Civil Rights Movement, on Black liberation struggles more broadly. And when I think through that kind of history, there's so many examples of fantastic, activist, anti-racist education programs. And so I'm thinking about the Black Panther Party's wonderful social and social and educational programs. I'm also thinking about like civil rights movement era education programs and activist training programs. Do you see any continuities between the ways that we're currently pursuing anti-racist education in either schools or other places where you've intervened and that history of education?
Yeah, I do. There are some areas of direct continuity. I think to answer that in sort of two parts. One of the accusations that is sort of current right now about what's going on in the classroom is this notion of indoctrination, right? So not only, you're teaching white kids to hate themselves, but it's this leftist indoctrination, right? There's no indoctrination, but we actually know what educational indoctrination looks like, right? We have a long history of that, and it's very much centered around the lost cause. How it came to be in the second decade of the 20th century, Daughters of the Confederacy, forming, censorship boards, right, to determine what textbooks can be taught in schools in the South that then impact. So we actually know what educational indoctrination looks like, right? Daughters of the Confederacy, again, sending Confederate flags, thousands of Confederate flags to public schools throughout the South, right? Hundreds of portraits of Robert E. Lee, right? So the version now of in Texas, they got to put something up, right? We know actually what educational indoctrination looks like, and it isn't something that scholars needed to identify in 2022. You go back to the civil rights era, activists understood what educational indoctrination was, right? So one of the things to see that direct connection, one of the things that comes out of the civil rights movement are explicit educational programs to deal with that. And even before we get to the Panthers in Oakland creating a school, we have the Freedom Schools in Mississippi in 1964, where you have student activists heading down into the heart of the Deep South and saying, we're not only going to register African Americans to vote, but we're going to create these schools in churches, in black businesses, under trees, in parks, because we understand the kind of negative race consciousness that is being bred by the existing educational curriculum in a state like Mississippi, right? And so they come up with this concept of freedom schools, and it transforms Mississippi, right? You can see the direct connection between kids who attended freedom schools and adults, and the first generation, beginning in the 1970s, of black elected officials in a state like Mississippi, and into the 1980s and the like. There's a direct line. But then you also get something like the Children's Defense Fund, right, which populates sort of the nation with freedom schools based upon that freedom school model. This was Marion Wright Edelman's organization. She just stepped down a little while ago. And so we see, right, like it's about empowering. It's about leaning into sort of identity and positive racial consciousness. There are a lot of, and that's a powerful program, right? And there are a lot of, I think, lessons that we can pull from the civil rights era and from history to deal exactly with some of the problems that we are confronting today.
It's fascinating. And I'll throw one question to you, Dr. McAvoy, and then after this, if you'd like to ask a question from the audience, if you can just queue behind the microphone so we can get you on the video, that'd be fantastic. So what I'll throw to you is this. You talk about using discussion in a classroom to empower students to have agency when we're talking about these politically controversial issues. And one thing that has always, I've always really appreciated about your research is that you talk about the need for specialized skills training if you're going to be leading discussion. And I would love there to be a world where every single teacher can take your workshops and can learn like the best tools available for doing discussion. But one thing I'm wondering is, in a world where not every school is going to do that, and where in some cases the teachers just aren't going to have the training to facilitate well, and to be able to lead a discussion in ways that are procedurally rich, but not not kind of leading people towards their views. do we want to still use discussion for these politically controversial topics in a world where not everybody's going to have the tools to do discussion as well as the participants in your workshop might be able to? This is a pitch for Paula's workshops.
I'm going to raise my rates as we move to this national training. So it's interesting. So your question is sort of saying if you think your discussion is going to go badly, should you still try to have the discussion? Yeah, that's an interesting question. So I don't think teachers, I mean, on the one hand, you learn discussion by doing discussion in some way, so you kind of have to sort of wade into it. But you shouldn't be teaching, I guess, if you feel unprepared for the job. And I think one different angle for your question is that nearly all teachers go through a college of education at some point, and they do get training, and there is a lot of professional development that teachers still have to go to. And so schools of education have a responsibility for preparing people to discuss. There's lots of materials out there for teachers to get better at discussion. A lot of them are free. There's lots of free and interesting, so there's the resources are out there. And I think that what I do in a lot of the workshops and what I do with my own students is there's these protocols that take students through that scaffold the learning of how to discuss. They put the teacher just really in sort of the guide on the side role and a lot of the responsibility on students. And so I find that if you teach the teachers the protocols, your facilitation job becomes much easier. And if you set it up properly, this background, then you can have a good discussion in the classroom. And then that leads towards more discussion. When it goes well, you feel better at discussion. So I think a misconception for a lot of people is that what we should be trying to do in all cases is have like these enriching seminar style discussions that you have in graduate school classrooms. And that's just not happening in ninth grade. And so you can get ninth graders to have those discussions, but you have to teach them how to do it. They don't naturally know how to do that. And so so teaching teachers the scaffolding tool, the protocols to get students towards that is the answer. And to break up in their own minds, the whole class discussion is what you're aiming for. A great paired sharing discussion, that's fine, that's good too. And a small group discussion is good too. And so I think we just sort of need to broaden our understanding. But I do, don't wade into topics that you're not prepared to, you need to prepare as a teacher before you start doing things. Yeah,
good. And I think this last one, just to follow up on that really quickly, and I'd invite both of you to weigh in on this. There have been times when I've known people who have said, I don't feel comfortable teaching this yet. I don't feel comfortable running a discussion on this particular topic, just because I don't think I'm at a place where I'm going to be able to be a neutral arbiter. And when I say neutral, I don't mean that they have to be neutral between correct and incorrect information. What I mean is that these people are worried about going into a discussion and not being able to be charitable and fair to all sides of, that might come up, that might reasonably come up in the discussion. And so what I'm wondering is for somebody like that who feels that way, I'm picking up on what you said sort of at the end of your comments, what advice would you have for somebody like that? And I'd love to ask both of you to weigh in on that.
So, a high school teacher gets, if they're teaching an academic year course, they have about 180 hours in the classroom, and they have to cover the content. And so there's really, the amount of time that you have for actual discussion is maybe you're going to get, 20% of that is going to be in discussion. So you have choices about what issues you're going to set up and which ones you're going to engage in. And so if you really feel strongly, this is not the issue for me, there's 50 other issues that you could pick up, and so you can find the issue that you can work with. And I don't, yes, you don't need to be fair. You don't need to be neutral, but you do need to be fair. So you need to find issues that you can fairly treat in the classroom and feel that students can leave with a variety of opinions, and I still feel like I have not miseducated or left, people less informed than before the discussion. So I think that it's just, you have a lot of choices to make, and so make the choices that are best for you. Yeah.
I have a little concerns about the sort of the underlying thinking about a teacher who's like, I don't know if I can manage this this particular conversation in this particular way. Because that's what you're there for, right? And you should have had the preparation, and if you don't feel comfortable, then you need to get comfortable, right? Or at least get comfortable with your discomfort, that's fine. I mean, if a firefighter was like, I don't feel comfortable running into the burning building, then your ass shouldn't be a firefighter, right? I mean, it's the same thing. There's certain conversations, as difficult and as challenging as they are, that we actually have to, like that's exactly when you're needed the most. So I would say, look, you gotta figure this out, or you gotta step aside.
So we'll jump over to audience questions now. Go for it.
Hello. Hi. So I'm Piers Turner in the philosophy department here. And so I didn't think I was going to necessarily have a question, but right on this very topic, I just wanted to ask about a different kind of approach to this thing we were just discussing. So, as a philosophy professor, I always thought I was going to be a high school teacher. That's what I wanted to be. And then, you're a philosophy professor, you get into philosophy and you realize you can't teach at the high school level except at a handful of places. And so you end up at a college level. And so, of course, now I'm the parent of 2 high schoolers. And of course, what I notice all the time when I go to the curriculum nights and stuff is that there's no philosophy, but I don't really mean to be saying that in kind of a very field-specific way. What I mean is I don't see room for just discussion and reflection of exactly the sort you were talking about. It's not that I think they should be learning about, Plato's metaphysics necessarily. I just think there should be room for the kind of discussion like that you've been talking about. So a different model would be one where, because teachers have to cover the content, and they can have some discussion in each of their classrooms, but would be to have an elective, say, I'm especially thinking at the high school level, where it's about deliberation. It's about continuing sort of civic training, for these young people so that they can talk across these differences effectively and try out the ideas where you've gone past questions 1 or 2, but now you really are trying to dig in on 3 and 4. And I guess what I'm really asking is, are there high schools, especially where there are models where people have tried to introduce deliberation-based civic education, and where that's working well for them? Because I'd be curious to hear more about that. Thanks.
So actually, in the book, The Political Classroom, we do feature a public school teacher who teaches an elective philosophy course, and he teaches an elective course called something like controversial issues or something. And it is a highly discussion based. Now that's just one teacher, but so he's been able in this particular school have the freedom to do that. But a different, and then there are different Chicago right now is really pushing a controversial issues curriculum and training teachers and how to do that. Still though, right now in social studies, there's the big national trend is to engage in inquiry. Inquiry is the buzz. Everyone's doing inquiry. And training, what I'm finding is that teachers have the hardest time switching from my job is to cover content to my job is to engage in meaning making with students. This is a big shift. This is really hard to do. And when I'm working with teachers and pre-service teachers around issues of inquiry, I do find in my head, because I have some philosophy background, they have the hardest time finding the interesting question. And because their history courses, I guess, in college didn't engage them in, not yours, obviously, you had lots of, but that because you majored in history, how do you not see the morally interesting question here, or the justice question here, and it's really hard. And so I've actually been thinking I need to do workshops for philosophy for teachers, and to get just for the purpose of saying that do you see how this is the interesting, how do you identify the interesting question?
Lots of interesting questions, but pivoting to the problem solving mode that's in questions 3 and 4, then how do you have those conversations, and I was wondering, can you farm it out in a sense to have an elective?
Sure, I think more curriculum, there's lots of facing history, street law, there's lots of civic ed shops that provide, in Stanford History Group, all these have materials that teachers can bring into the classroom, and they generally ask pretty good questions. It's just getting the teachers comfortable and willing to do it. And the biggest, the biggest resistance from the part of teachers is, yeah, but the test. Yeah, but I have to, yeah, but my team at my school, we all have to give the same multiple choice test at the end. Oh my God. And there's really we're at odds with national trends to hold it, teachers have to be accountable to the standards, and you have to put your standard on your lesson before you teach. And so we're, the idea of like helping students engage in these questions is in tension with the different message, which is cover content and make sure that they learned it and have, standardize your assessments, et cetera. And so that's where the real rub is that, but I still, in North Carolina, the teacher is around, they have 90-minute classes. I'm like, you could do a lot in a 90-minute class, and still, it's a 45-minute lecture and 45 minutes of like doing something sort of lame at your seat, and I can't, I try every which way. And some teachers do a great job, but really it's, AP classes get pretty good curriculum, and then as you move down into sort of the honors, and then we have this Darwinian doublespeak academic level, which means the lowest tracked class. And so it just gets less and less likely that you have discussion, that you have these opportunities, et cetera. So there's a real equity issue in which types of students get the interesting and engaging curriculum.
If I could just add real quick, I just reviewed and I was happy to review. I wasn't happy; it took too much time. But I was once I reviewed it, I was happy. Connecticut is doing its revising, reimagining its social studies standards, and K through 12, right, all the way up. And it was very much question-driven, right? Mm-hmm. Inquiry was very much a part of it. But you could see in it, it was covering, what needed to be covered. But in each of whether it was economics or history or government and civics, I mean, it were asking questions, right? And also, I mean, one of the guiding principles was sort of justice, right? As their charge. And so within the question was, how does this reflect, creating a just society? And so they're still in the process, but it's moving forward. So it was nice to see, because it was that. And certainly in my own class, in my own teaching, I have, from just 10 years ago, I probably offer, 40% less content, like in my classes, just me. Because I'm like, they got it all in their back pocket on a cell phone anyway, right? So what are the questions? What are the conversations? What are the discussions? What are the debates that we can have around these issues that they can then fill in later? Because that's what they remember.
Hi, this is Henry from a grad student at Philosophy and History of Education. I wanted to push back on that idea when you say, Professor, about it's too late when they're grown up. I feel like we approach too many times education as in this thing that is just going to happen in the classroom, and so we just want to give you the facts and we want you to know the truth, and this is what happened. But I feel like our goal goes beyond that, right? We want those students to go outside and have at least a conversation. We're not trying to raise an army of activists, but if they just keep that knowledge to themselves, if they never object to somebody making a claim, I feel like we fail. So shouldn't we focus more on that idea that, hey, this student, we're just giving in basically a loaded gun of information, and they're gonna go home and they're gonna say, hey, Dad, guess what I learned today? Or they're gonna make a social media post about this. Should we spend more time thinking in that aspect? And so that much broader conception of education, I guess, is what I'm getting at. Thank you. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, I think it's fair. I think your point is fair. And I certainly didn't mean to, let me defend my point for a second, right? I mean, we know that the older it is, the older students get, the more entrenched in their beliefs they become, right? And so obviously it's never too late to learn, and we should all be lifelong learners. My point was, like, let's not wait, right? Let's begin early and let's build on that. Because when it comes to something like American history in this context and these difficult subjects, we have to do, particularly American history, we have to do, and global history is an extension of it, we have to do as much unlearning in the classroom as we have to do learning. right? I mean, I spend as much time so deconstructing narratives before I can even get to the stuff that I need them to learn about. And it would sure be nice if they had some of that done before they got to my class. So I think we should, one, be always in this process of, as individuals, as human beings, of learning, but also of teaching. And so to the second point, I would fully agree that, you know, we share what we do. I want my students to share what they learn in the classroom. The two things I tell them, right, in the classroom is, at the end of the class, I want you to know everything that I know, right, which is impossible. But we can get close. We can try, right? I've been at this a long time. But then don't keep it to yourself. And I don't even have to tell them that, right? I mean, they begin to share. And so during one of the strangest, but also one of the loveliest things that I encountered during the pandemic when we went virtual, especially during that first fall, I was teaching a course on civil rights movement, had 120 students in the class, right? Literally scattered around the country because nobody was on campus, right? And you know, that's 5 Zoom pages, if you can imagine, right? And I get 2 or 3 Zoom pages with the cameras on, right? I mean, so the kids were engaged, right? I'll take that, right? That's 3/4 of the class. About 3/4 of the way through the class, one day I'm looking at and I never went past the first page anyway. I'm looking at the camera, and I don't know, the kid bumps the camera, moves the computer or whatever, and there's like, the kid's mom is sitting like with the kid, right? And I was like, oh. I was like, hi, right? And she's like, oh, I didn't realize I was on camera. She's like, how you doing? And I was like, are you know, so-and-so's mom? I didn't know the kid, right? She said, yeah. And I said, oh, you just stopping in? She's like, no, you know, I've been here since the 3rd week, right? And I was like, really? And she was like, yeah, he was talking about the stuff, and it was so interesting, you know, I just decided to sit in. And then these other cameras turned on. It was like, oh, I'm so-and-so's dad, I'm so-and-so's mom. It was a dozen parents who was sitting there with, I mean, they were home too, but they were picking up on what the kid was doing, right? On what the kid was learning and sharing, right? And so I think, yes, I mean, it doesn't necessarily have to lead to everybody becoming active, because that's not gonna happen, but at least they were intrigued enough to share with the parents, and the parents got interested too. So they became teachers as well.
If I could just add, I do think we need to think differently about K-12 education, because the reality is not everyone goes to college, not everyone majors on history in college, not everyone takes a history class in college. And there's a real problem if we only are expecting 10% of the population to actually understand the history of the country. So we need better education at the earlier levels if we have a hope of all getting on the same, getting something similar to the same story. So, and there's a difference between training people to be activists and to just being active. And I think that that's an important distinction.
I can't see a clock, so I have no idea what time it is. Hi, thank you for lovely thoughts on this. I'm Jamie, I'm a grad student here. And I informally teach pre-service teachers. Some of them end up in my classroom. And we have a lot of conversations about the schooling system and their motivations to be teachers. And I'm wondering, so we talked a lot about the duty to be a teacher and basically like the fears of being a teacher, and maybe if you're not up for kind of fulfilling this obligation that you have, maybe you shouldn't be fulfilling this role in a democratic society, right? And then we kind of place this duty on education schools or schools of education to ensure that the teachers that they are sending out in the world understand the role that they're going to play and feel like they can actually occupy that space and do it well. And I'm wondering, how do you go about having that conversation with 18 and 19-year-olds that are very excited to be teachers and to fulfill a role that does not pay them very well, for which a lot of folks, including their peers and perhaps their parents, are kind of doubtful of their motivations. And they come into your classroom really determined to teach first graders or to teach high school math. And then they engage in these conversations, feel fearful, and then find comfort perhaps in the fact that they'll be teaching first graders or they'll be teaching math. So maybe they don't necessarily need to engage in this duty in the same way that perhaps a high school social studies teacher would be engaging. So I'm kind of wondering if you have any recommendations for how to frame that, hey, if you're not up for this, maybe don't go into teaching conversation when we do need teachers and they do have kind of what we'd call some sort of wholesome motivation to work with kids in an era when other people don't want to be paid to do that. So how do we have that conversation that is like, this is your role in a democratic society if you're going to be paid to do this, and make sure you can do it well, and if not, maybe get out of this classroom and, choose a different major, because there's no repercussions for having spent the last 2 years of your life paying for credits to be a teacher when we're telling you maybe it's not going to be what's best for you. So recommendations on how to have that conversation.
Do you want me to take that? Yeah, I hear that point. I mean, I feel your concern. And so on the one hand, when there's people who want to teach and you want to give them a clear-eyed picture of what they're walking into, and I think that's the right thing to do, that you need to understand what you're walking into. But you also, but to your point, you don't want the message to be, schools are oppressive, miserable places where you're going to be terribly paid and parents are going to be mad at you all the time. Get out there, kid, right? That doesn't work. So you do need to provide some hope within that learning, that this is something you can do. I mean, honestly, though, I'm in a state where the starting salary for a first-year teacher with a master's degree in some parts of my state is $37,000. So why? Why would you do that to yourself? and you're going to be, you're going to be overworked. We have a teacher shortage of 6,000. So you don't want to be turning people away from the profession. Like if you have an inkling that you want to get in there, let's make sure that they actually get in there and try it. But I think that the College of Education cannot simply be the message of, of this, it's all bad, and it's, there are skills that people can learn. There's curriculum that you can use. There's, so we need to be giving them the how-to, not just the whys or the look out for this. So I do think you feel hope when you feel like you can do it. And so we have to be able to make sure we're teaching that this is the how to do it. And here's strategies to use and skills. So that, I think that's where the hope is in the, and here's how.
I would add that the part of the messaging is we need you. We absolutely need you in the classroom. But you can't hide behind a math book and you can't hide behind first graders, right? And so you are going to be, it's incumbent upon you to engage in all of these issues in ways that you can in the subjects that you teach and in the grades that you teach. But we absolutely need you. And it's a tough time. The rewards are not great, right? But it is absolutely fulfilling, right? And we need folk who are committed and passionate about it. But you can't be afraid in that sense, right? You can't dodge it, right? Because the time for dodging is over.
I'll just add that one thing I also think is you might think you can hide in the first grade classroom, but you teach 1 year and you're going to see that there's issues coming in your class that you did not expect. So there's a little bit of, they just don't know what they don't know yet.
So we have time for one more quick question. Go for it.
Good morning. I'm a former first grade teacher and current policy student, so this ties in pretty well. You've established that we have a moral obligation to do this work in the classroom, but assuming that these divisive content laws pass, what is our obligation then, and how do we accomplish that goal in the face of legal and economic consequences?
So right now, you can still teach everything that needs to be taught because state standards have not changed in almost every one of these states. Florida is acting a little funky right now, and they're trying to change state standards, which is going to be problematic. But right now, in most of these states, even here in Ohio, all you have to do is say, I'm just teaching what the standards are, right? I mean, so that actually provides cover. Again, the push now is really to sort of move those standards, and they're drawing on this university coming out of Michigan that has anyway. But so that's a little cover right there. Also, I think, especially for those who, and it doesn't matter the subject or the grade, I mean, you're not telling anybody, like, yes, there's no point in defending critical race theory if you're teaching elementary school, right? I mean, that media argument has been lost. There's no reason for it even to leave your lips. But you should be teaching about democracy, right? You should be teaching about civics and good government. You should be teaching about fairness and equality, right? I mean, so there's a framing that I think you have to be smart about, that teachers have to be smart about. Certainly, depending upon district, you got to be a little bit more politically savvy, right, and understand your district, where you are versus, I mean, so the suburban, white suburban, rural is different than urban districts in terms of what you can do right now. So I think you can't be naive in terms of what you want to say, but what you should be doing in the classroom, there's enough cover there where you can do it. I would also say, lastly, that one of the things that any teacher should be doing, and this is somewhat counterintuitive, right? Like as a parent, right? Keep parents out. Like I don't want to deal with parents now, and I'm a crazy parent. And is invite parents into the classroom early on. There's nothing that teachers are going to be doing, right, that is actually aligned with any of the nonsense that people are being accused of. And so if you open the classroom, particularly within limits, right? I mean, but if you open the classroom and invite parents to say, hey, this is what we're doing, this is why we're doing it at the very beginning, right? Teachers are like Congress people now, right? Everybody hates Congress, but they like their teacher, right? For the most part, right? But you invite them in and you see, like, if parents see what you're actually doing, they're like, oh, that makes sense. Like, I get that. But that's important because when you get the 2 or 3, right, parents who want to act up and say, oh, this is Fox News right here, right, what they're doing in the classroom. Then you have parents who are like, that's not what's happening, right? I know, right, because I've been following along. I know that's not what's happening. And so you got to have, this is Ohio State's a football college, right? I mean, you got to have some blockers, right, when you're trying to make it downfield, right? And those parents become the best advocates, the best blockers for you, but they can only do it if they know what you're doing, right? And it's nothing to hide. We don't have anything to hide in the classroom. So you let people know what you're doing, right? And why you're doing it and how you're doing it. And if it comes up as an issue, then you have those people who are on your side. That's political organizing, right? And you got to do some of that now too.
I agree with all of that, and I would just add that teachers need to be working together. I'm in a state that has a toothless union. It's like that's the right, but we have the right to work. But teachers there is a union. That teachers nevertheless need to be collectively working together and figuring out how they're responding, and to give political cover to each other. So we all agree that we do this. This is happening in all the classrooms. This is. And figuring out how to do it. So I do think we've dismantled teachers' unions tremendously throughout the country, but there's still room for teachers to work together, and they need to. I think that's an important part of this story.
Thank you. I'd like to take all the wonderful questions that we got. Those were fantastic. And I'd like to give another round to our speakers. Thank you for this wonderful presentation.
Thank you.